discovered the stretch of Mississippi River called Cancer Alley, which is the about 140-mile stretch of river between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And it's an industrial corridor of refineries, probably the second largest in the United States. And I began photographing there, and I met the locals, and it was known as Cancer Alley. It had high levels of cancer and other diseases like asthma and other bronchial issues too. So I did a series of photographs in 1998, and I published some of the work with Aperture at that point in a magazine. I did a show at the High Museum, and then put the work away for a while. And in 2009, the High Museum contacted me again and said, and as part of the original commission, the High Museum got 10 large photographs and about 45 small 8x10 prints, contact prints. And the High Museum approached me and said, we really love a lot of the smaller work. Can we look at that and do a new show, revisit the project? We thought, they thought it was an important project. So I said yes, but what I'd like to do is go back and photograph again, sort of follow up on what I had photographed in 1998 and see if things got worse or better or stayed the same. So originally when I photographed in 1998, I had kept a journal of what I was seeing, and with drawings and ideas for interventions in the landscape. Originally, I had hoped to not only point out all the toxic nature of this environment, but also maybe how it could be, we could sort of convene in it and fix it up, sort of turn it into a national park, if you will. Sort of completely just take over the industries and take over the buildings, the refineries, turn them into museums because they're such interesting architecture. So I had these sort of fantasy things, but I never published them, I never did anything with them. They were just sort of my response at the moment. When the High Museum contacted me in 2010, I wanted to revisit that idea, and somebody introduced me to Kate Orff, who's a landscape architect. She teaches at Columbia, and she's brilliant, and I showed her my book dummy and these ideas and my ideas for my interventions in the landscape, and she pointed out how sophomoric they were. They were, very idealistic and romantic, but they weren't very real. They weren't going to do anything. And but what she did is she looked at the photographs and said, but there's another way to approach this that might be really, really interesting. And that would be, she looked at the photographs and said, in each one of these photographs, you have the history of the landscape, you have the future of the landscape, and then if you look vertically, you can see the economics, the politics, the environmental issues, the health issues. All these issues are embedded in there, and she wanted to unpack them. And so we began collaborating, which was just amazing, and she took the photographs and the book dummy, and she started studying the photographs, and she began to unpack different photographs, and with a new sort of system of graphics, which she calls through lines. And there are statistics, there are maps, there are really deep research into each of the places that I photographed in the landscapes. And so the book is actually divided. The first part of the book are my photographs with my texts, and the second part are her unpacking of those photographs with, I think, about 140 pages of maps and through lines and sort of deep, profound research into the whole history of oil and petrochemical industry. And then finally, in the back of the book, there's it was inspired by Kate, by being a Girl Scout, the Girl Scout handbook. And it's called the Handbook, and it's basically a slip-in booklet that's a series of models of alternatives to the landscape that we have today. And it's on micro scale, smaller scale things, but also really big scale things that people are doing today that are alternatives. And that's the project in a nutshell. So the On the Beach series, which began right after 9/11, I was in Washington, D.C. on September 10th. There was an exhibition for the Nature Conservancy opening at the Corcoran Gallery. And the next morning we were signing the catalog at the Corcoran, and we were evacuated because it was a block away from the White House. And my son at the time was in a dorm at NYU, and so I was trying to get a hold of him, which I couldn't. He was sleeping in while this was happening. And in the next couple of days, so I ended up going from Washington, D.C. To New York City, and getting my son out of there. And I thought immediately I should go get my cameras and go and photograph like any photographer, that impulse. And then I decided against it. It wasn't really what I do. I don't do things like that, but such just a major event. But I regrouped and I came back to California, which is where I live, thought about it, went into the desert to try to photograph and see if this whole event, which traumatized everybody, somehow could be realized in my photographs, and nothing happened. It was sort of a lost trip. And then I went to Hawaii, and mostly on a pre-planned vacation. But what happened was there was these photographs from 9/11 of these people falling from the buildings, and those actually I had really had big impact on me, and I had stuck them up on my studio wall. There's a bunch of them, and somebody actually sent me some from Italy that hadn't been published in the United States. And they showed these, small figures falling through space with the buildings behind them, and there's something existentially sublime about that moment of these figures, falling to their death. And strangely enough, like atomic mushroom cloud, they weren't horrifying. They were sublime, just much more existential than I expected. And when I went to Hawaii, I suddenly saw people in the landscape in this vast, against the sea, the vast sea and things. I saw a fragility and sort of a relationship to that. So it's a very indirect relationship to 9/11. I know I wouldn't have made that work with all those experiences. If anybody looking at the photographs, they would guess in a million years it had anything to do with 9/11. And that was never important. It really wasn't about that. It was really about the source of the inspiration. And the way I photographed it was so oblique and away from the reality of it, and yet to me it did symbolize sort of a lot of aspects of it in a very personal way. I find I a lot of times wake up in the middle of the night with an idea, and it just takes off, and I don't know where that comes from. It's definitely not very rational or anything like that. The Destroy This Memory book, that's a book. I photographed Katrina, and I decided to put the work away for 20 years. But on the 5th year anniversary, I woke up in the middle of the night with a book in my head, literally in my head, which was to go through 3,000 photographs and pick just the photographs where people had spray painted messages on their homes, on their on walls, on their cars, on trees, and take those where it was their own words, and turn it into a book, like a found poem. And the book has no text, no page numbers, only their words. And I literally woke up in the middle of the night. I hadn't even thought about it before. With that in my head, I went to my studio, I printed out all these pictures that I knew I had files of, laid them out, and within 3 days I made the book. Yeah, and it just all came in like a quasi-dream. Yeah, so every time there's a new technological advance in history, in fact, in anything, whether it's in architecture, computers have now allowed architects to design like Frank Gehry buildings with, in strange forms and things, or the invention of the telescope or the microscope, it allows science to learn more about things. And photography is no different. Every time there's been a technological advance, whether it's a 35 millimeter camera, color film, there's always resistance at first. People thought photography was dead when 35 millimeter camera was introduced. So it was just anybody can do it. Kodak takes a picture and you do the rest, all that kind of stuff. And the same thing with digital. There was a big symposium in San Francisco at the San Francisco Museum of Art, I think about a year and a half ago, saying is photography dead because of digital technology, and now people can manipulate with Photoshop, and it's like what we know as photography is dead, but in fact it's just the opposite. It's now advanced the language to a new level, and I think we're at the beginning of one of the biggest revolution in photography. In the 70s, when I was photographing in color, most of my galleries didn't want to handle the work because it was color photographs. It was just a handful of people working in color at the time. It was really not considered serious photography because it wasn't black and white. Now, of course, today, 99.9% of people are working in color. Not only has photography been completely revolutionized, but the whole art world has been impacted by color photography. So I think digital photography is going to be, exponentially more powerful in terms of the impact. I think I make documents, but it's really important that the pictures are formally really powerful. You know, the way they're composed, the use of color. I did a series of dead animal pit photographs, probably about 450. I go to great care to compose them really well and edit them. It's only the very, very best, strongest formal images, because I believe that those resonate over time. That I believe in beauty as a delivery system. Like I often cite John Stewart's humor. He actually makes really powerful political points with jokes. You know, he uses humor. Or Shakespeare uses language beautifully to talk about tragedy. I think the formal beauty of photography is a really powerful way to convey difficult, problematic ideas. And I think of my photographs as sort of capturing a historical moment. I think of more of that way rather than being news. You know, they're not really newsworthy. They're always old news. There's nothing really new about that. But news tends to be digested quickly and spit out. And I think art, and I think if you distinguish sort of journalism from art, I think art is sort of meant to last longer in a way. I mean, obviously, journalism can be art, and art can cross over into journalism. But yeah, I think the formal properties of a beautifully made photograph actually transcend time. Yeah, the art market, that's a really complicated question. You know, when I first started photography, the idea of living off of selling photographs wasn't even possible. I mean, you know, it was like being a poet. If you wanted to be a photographer, then you taught or you did another job, and that was fine. That was great. The art market is slowly built up, and now it's sort of exploding exponentially. I mean, there's photographs are getting really expensive, and it's and highly collectible and all that. And I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, it's been great. Knock on wood. It's allowed me to just do my work. I haven't had to teach, even though I love teaching. It's allowed me to focus solely on working, and I've been able to support myself, and I think that's great. But I also think there is potential that it's sort of you get sort of a 1%, 1% kind of phenomenon, which is there's a high stratus of artists selling work and making lots of money, and then just all these people in another level struggling, and it's complicated. It's really complicated. I honestly don't know in the big picture. I think there's obviously upsides to being a viable art market, and it's very strong, by the way. It's just, I don't see it getting any weaker. I think it's just going to get stronger and stronger. I mean, photography really has come of age, ironically, because it's now become commercially viable at the high end. You'll have to wait and see. I'm always working. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I'm working on a bunch of. I'm working on about 5 different books over the next 3 years, and until they're sort of made, I don't really like to talk about them too much because it's sort of a jinx.